Welcome to today's video lecture. In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about supporting your point. And as usual, I want to start out by asking you a question, which is what happens if your presentation lacks solid, persuasive content? This is what happens. Your presentation is running on empty. Your presentation has no more power, no more drive, no more forward momentum than a car that doesn't have gas in the tank. So how can we fill up the gas in the tank of your presentation? We can do so by packing your presentation with content that is logical, that speaks to your credibility, and that appeals to emotion. Now, not coincidentally, these three characteristics, logic, credibility, emotion, correspond to important principles of persuasion. In fact, these principles of persuasion are so important, they're so essential, that we've been talking about them since the days of ancient Greece, which is why these terms, these principles of persuasion, have Greek names. We've got logos for logic. We've got ethos for credibility. We've got pathos for emotion. Now, these three principles of persuasion are the organizing principles of this lecture. We're going to start out by talking about logic, the most important of the three classical principles of persuasion. We're then going to move over to ethos or credibility. And finally, we're going to close out by talking about pathos or emotional appeals. Let's start out by talking about appeals to logos or to logic. You can appeal to logos in a variety of different ways, but perhaps the simplest and the most important way to appeal to logos is by following those techniques for effectively structuring a presentation that we talked about in the video lecture on structure. So if you follow an orderly, intuitive structure, you are, in fact, helping to appeal to logic or to logos. If you begin by identifying a problem or need, if you then propose a solution to that problem or need, if you follow that up by outlining the benefits of your solution and wrap up by providing an implementation plan, you're structuring your presentation in a way that corresponds to your audience's expectations. And they will see it as being logical and well structured, and therefore more persuasive and more compelling. You can also appeal to logos by supporting your claims with 2 to 3 pieces of evidence. And there are a variety of forms of evidence, but in a business context, you're going to want to focus on using a handful of sets of evidence types. So you're going to want to focus on data or data visualizations, case studies, pictures and images, personal experiences or stories and testimonials. Now, just a quick note, when you use these kinds of evidence, you're going to want to cite them in a variety of different ways. So first, I'd like you to cite them verbally in your presentation. If you're referencing a story from the New York Times, then mention the source of that information in the New York Times in your presentation itself. You can also cite your evidence on your slides. We'll talk about how to do that later on in the course. And then finally, you should cite that information in your written outline. Okay, and you can use standard citation techniques in that written outline. Now, when you're supporting your claims with evidence, you want to be sure to put that evidence in context, and you want to avoid death by numbers. In business settings, we tend to find quantitative information quite compelling, rightly so. But if you overuse data, if you overuse numbers and quantitative information, you will overwhelm your audience and they'll begin to check out. So make sure that you're using data and quantitative information somewhat sparingly. Next, you can appeal to logos by rebutting potential objections. That's something that we talked about in the video lecture on structure. And finally, you can appeal to logos by making your evidence intelligible and memorable. You don't just want evidence that supports your point. You want evidence that is memorable, that has flash, that has pizzazz. Okay? So please keep that in mind as you're crafting, as you're curating the evidence to support your presentation. Next, let's talk about ethos or credibility. Now, when you're determining how extensively you should appeal to credibility, you should be asking yourself a series of questions. Will the audience believe or trust me? Will the audience respect me? Will the audience think that I have a good character? Do they believe that I'm an authority? Depending upon how you answer these questions, you're going to either add more or subtract some of those ethos appeals. Now, you can appeal to ethos both directly and indirectly. You can appeal to it directly by mentioning your job, your expertise, your experience, your education, right? Any of those experiences or characteristics that tend to lend an individual credibility in a professional context. But you can also appeal to ethos through nonverbal factors like delivery and attire. If you're well dressed, if you're well groomed, if you're presenting in a way that is compelling, confident, and polished, that will give you credibility as well. And finally, let's wrap up by talking about pathos appeals or appeals to emotions. Now, as with every other principle of persuasion, there are a variety of ways in which you can appeal to pathos or to emotion. But one of the most powerful ways in which you can do so is by using images in your PowerPoint or your slide deck. Imagine that you're giving a presentation on animals who have suffered. You're trying to convince folks to adopt pets. What more powerful image could you present than some of the animals who have been affected by mistreatment? A dog who is missing one of its legs, a cat that's missing an eye. These are powerful emotional appeals. Imagine that you're talking about the importance of collecting trash and eliminating plastic from the world's oceans. What's more powerful than showing an image of a shoreline that's covered in plastic? It's not manipulative because you're using an image that corresponds to something that's real. You're not making any of this stuff up. But nevertheless, you are tugging at people's heartstrings by forcing them to confront the immediacy of this issue in a very emotionally powerful way. But you're not just limited to images when appealing to emotion. You can also appeal to pathos in your language. And you can do so by evoking evidence or telling stories that evoke regret, that evoke fear, that evoke pleasure or responsibility. Some of those emotions that are most likely to appear in a business context. Regret about not pursuing an investment opportunity. Fear about missing out on a competitive advantage. Pleasure at the joys of teamwork, of success. Responsibility to your customers or your investors or your fellow workers, right? All of those are totally acceptable pathos appeals in the context of a business presentation. Okay, so to recap, as we close out today's video lecture, we talked about logos or appeals to logic, the most important persuasive appeals that you can include in your presentations. We talked about ethos or appeals to credibility. And finally, we talked about pathos or appeals to emotion. As always, thanks for watching, everybody.